There's no open market of ideas when it comes to discussing these things. You're compelled and enforced into certain categories.
Jonathan Haidt is he's a psychologist at the New York University Business School. He's done a really good job of documenting the dearth of ideological viewpoints, let's say political or temperamental viewpoints, because that's more accurate, in the modern university. And it's appalling because along with all this push for ethnic and sexual and racial diversity, which I think is just a mask to enforce a kind of ideological homogeneity, there's no even understanding that ideational diversity is the only relevant value for a university. The rest of it's all predicated, say, on the assumption that if you do select people because of their ethnicity or racial background or gender, that will in and of itself produce diversity of ideas, which is another really pernicious idea because it assumes that, and it's so contradictory. The left describes anything that's associated with the assumption that someone who's female, for example, will think in a female way. They regard that as an unreasonable prejudice. Yet they're perfectly reasonable to say that we need more women in X discipline because they will bring in female ideas. It's like, well, what the hell are female ideas? You can't have it both ways unless you're completely, unless you don't care at all about coherence or consistency, and ideologues really don't, because they care about putting their ideology forth. But the idea that you're going to get a diversity of ideas because you have a diversity of class of people assumes that ideas and identity are the same thing, and that's an absurd proposition. In fact, that's an essentially racist proposition. Black people think differently than white people. No, some do and some don't, and the overlap is substantive, and the difference between the individuals is far greater than the difference between the groups.
I think we also need to make a very clear distinction between discrimination and people that are just inclined to gravitate towards different careers and different focuses. There's a big difference between women being forced out of tech and women being not as compelled to enter into tech careers as men. But
yeah, well, the tech issue is a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that, of course, high tech basically developed after the playing field for men and women was more or less leveled. I mean, that happened in the 1970s. And despite that, there aren't anywhere near as many women in tech. There's far more women in caring professions, and you see that particularly in Scandinavia, where they've done everything they can to equalize the playing field. It's 20-to-1 female to male nurses and 20-to-1 male to female engineers.
Explain that if you could, the Scandinavia issue, because it's very interesting what they've done over there and what the results have been.
Yeah, well, imagine that there are two reasons that people differ. There are more than two, but just imagine for the time being that there are two. One is for environmental reasons, cultural reasons, and the other is for biological reasons. What happens if you flatten out the environmental reasons, which is what's happened in Scandinavia, is you maximize the biological differences. You don't get rid of them, you maximize them. And so what's happened in Scandinavia is that men and women are more different from a temperament and personality perspective, and also in terms of their interests. They're more different in Scandinavia than they are anywhere else in the world.
Now, what have they done to try to flatten things out, as you say?
Well, they've transformed their social policies so that men and women have as close to equal opportunity, say, as any society has managed. But that hasn't produced the hope for equality of outcome. Quite the contrary. In many situations, it's exaggerated it. And you could say that that's actually okay, is that what you want is to have a society where the genuine differences between people are free to manifest themselves. So, for example, if you have 3 or 4 kids, say, the kids are going to be different from one another genetically. That's why they're not identical twins. They differ genetically. And if you set the environment up so that each child is supportive, the children actually turn out quite differently. Now, if you're an absolute brute and you beat them and you abuse them, then they'll all turn out the same because there's tremendous environmental influence on them then. But if you form an individual relationship with each of them and allow their strengths to manifest themselves as they will in a supportive environment, then the kids are going to turn out very different. And so a free society is actually one that produces massively unequal outcomes because it allows the genuine differences between people to manifest themselves. These people who are pushing equity, which is equality of outcome, that's what the word equity codes for, by the way, equality of outcome and not equality of opportunity, I don't know what in the world they do with regards to the fact that a very large number of professions are, high quality, high pay professions are female dominated. Physicians, for example, psychologists, any of the disciplines that have to do with human care are almost inevitably dominated by women, and that's increasingly the case. Is we're supposed to stop that? Is that also a sign of oppression? We're going to force women to do things they're not interested in?
Well, there's also a very disingenuous way of framing it here in America where people consistently, even the President of the United States, Obama, was talking about income inequality. And the way they frame income inequality, they talk about the 79 cents to the dollar. But what they don't discuss is that we're talking about completely different careers. We're not. The way they frame it, they frame it as if two people are working side by side. One is a man, one is a woman. They're both doing the same job. The man makes $1, the woman makes 79 cents. Yeah. That is not the case.
Well, it's typical of ideological conversation, because what happens technically, like imagine that we talked about poverty a few minutes ago, and we said, well, there's many reasons that one person might have more money than another. There are many reasons why women might make less money on average than men. There are small businesses that women run, for example, make far less money than small businesses that men run. But that's partly because a lot of women run their businesses part-time because they have kids. It's also partly because men do all the horrible, dangerous jobs, the ones where there's a high chance of dying. Men are much more likely to work outside. Men are much more likely to move in pursuit of a career opportunity. There are lots of reasons that men and women differ in terms of their income. But if you're an ideologue, you can only handle one variable. Oh, men and women measured en masse don't have the same incomes. Therefore, the system is corrupt.
Right.
Jesus, how much thinking does it take to come up with a theoretical scenario like that? It's so boneheaded, and it just pushes the ideological, it just pushes the ideology forward with no thought.